The bitter cold of the Montana winter night cut through Sarah Blackburn's threadbare coat like it wasn't even there. Her fingers had gone numb hours ago, and her toes weren't far behind as she trudged through knee-deep snow toward the faint glow of lamplight in the distance. The year was 1878, and the promise of a new life out west had turned to ash in her mouth faster than she could have imagined. The blizzard had caught her stagecoach miles from its destination, forcing the passengers and driver to seek shelter in a small way station. When morning came, the others continued on their journey, but Sarah had remained behind, waiting for her brother who was supposed to meet her. 3 days had passed and still no sign of him. With her money dwindling and the way station keeper's patience wearing thin, she had set out on foot toward the nearest ranch, hoping for work or at least shelter until she could figure out what to do next. By the time she reached the property, night had fallen and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. The main house was dark, but she spotted a stable nearby. Without hesitation, she stumbled toward it, pulled open the heavy wooden door, and slipped inside. The sudden absence of wind was a blessing. Sarah collapsed onto a pile of hay in an empty stall, too exhausted to go any further. The stable was cold, but compared to the howling storm outside, it felt almost warm. The scent of horses and hay filled her nostrils as she curled into a tight ball, trying to conserve what little body heat she had left. She didn't know how long she'd been asleep when the sound of boots on wooden planks startled her awake. Panic seized her chest. She was trespassing after all. Before she could move, a lantern's glow illuminated the stall, and she found herself staring up at the silhouette of a tall man. "Madam, are you all right?" His voice was deep, tinged with concern rather than anger. Sarah tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. She managed only to nod, though even that small movement sent pain shooting through her frozen limbs. The man crouched down, bringing the lantern closer. In its light, Sarah could see his face weathered but young, perhaps 30, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and eyes the color of a summer sky. He wore a sheepskin coat dusted with snow and a worn Stetson hat pulled low over his forehead. "My name's Zeke Armstrong." "This is my ranch," he said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "You're half frozen. Can you stand?" Sarah tried to push herself up, but her muscles refused to cooperate. Seeing her struggle, Zeke set down the lantern and gently helped her to her feet. When her legs buckled, he caught her without hesitation. "I'm sorry," she whispered, mortified by her weakness. "I didn't mean to trespass. I just needed somewhere to shelter from the storm. Don't apologize. No one should be out in this weather," Zeke replied. He studied her face for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "I'm taking you to the house. You need to warm up before you catch your death." Before Sarah could protest, Zeke had swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her out of the stable and through the swirling snow toward the dark shape of the main house. Sarah was too cold and tired to feel embarrassed. She found herself pressing her face against his chest, soaking in his warmth. The house was a modest but solid structure, built to withstand the harsh Montana winters. Inside, embers still glowed in the fireplace. Zeke set Sarah down in a chair near the hearth and quickly built up the fire until it roared with welcome heat. Sarah extended her hands toward the flames, wincing as feeling began to return to her fingers. "You're lucky I came to check on the horses," Zeke said as he hung his coat and hat on a peg by the door. "Most nights I wouldn't head out to the stable so late." "I am grateful," Sarah managed to say through chattering teeth. "Truly. I don't know what would have happened if—" "Let's not think about that," he interrupted gently. He disappeared into another room and returned with a blanket which he wrapped around her shoulders. "Are you hungry?" Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of the hollow ache in her stomach. She hadn't eaten since morning, and even then it had been only a hard biscuit and some jerky. While Zeke busied himself at the stove, warming up what smelled like stew, Sarah took stock of her surroundings. The house was neat, but sparsely furnished, with a few pieces of sturdy wooden furniture and practical items. There were no feminine touches, no curtains on the windows, no decorative pillows on the worn sofa, no pictures on the walls except for a single framed photograph of an older couple that she assumed were his parents. "I don't live fancy," Zeke said, noticing her gaze, "but it's warm and dry." "It's wonderful," Sarah replied honestly. After weeks of travel and the uncertainty of the past few days, a warm room and the promise of food seemed like luxury beyond measure. Zeke placed a steaming bowl of stew in front of her along with a hunk of bread. Sarah wanted to devour it all in seconds, but she forced herself to eat slowly, savoring each bite and feeling strength return to her body with every mouthful. "So," Zeke said, settling into a chair across from her with his own bowl, "what brings a young woman out to these parts alone?" "And in this weather?" Sarah hesitated, wondering how much to share with this stranger who had shown her such kindness. Something in his steady gaze made her decide on the truth. "My name is Sarah Blackburn. My brother Thomas homesteaded land near here about 2 years ago. He sent for me after our parents died last summer. There was nothing left for me in Boston. He was supposed to meet me at the way station, but he never came." Her voice faltered. "The station master said no one had heard from him in weeks." Zeke's expression darkened. "Thomas Blackburn has a place about 10 miles north of here." Sarah's heart leaped. "Yes, do you know him?" Zeke set down his spoon, his face grave. "Miss Blackburn, I'm sorry to tell you this, but there was an accident. Thomas's cabin caught fire about a month ago." By the time anyone noticed the smoke, it was too late. The world seemed to tilt beneath Sarah. "He's dead," Zeke nodded solemnly. "I'm afraid so. Some of us from nearby ranches helped bury him on his land. We tried to find out if he had family, but there were no letters or addresses to be found." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. She had traveled over 2,000 miles to join the only family she had left, only to discover she was entirely alone in the world. The tears spilled over, running silently down her cheeks. Zeke reached across the table and awkwardly patted her hand. "I'm truly sorry to be the one to tell you this." Sarah wiped at her tears with the corner of the blanket. "What am I going to do now?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "First, you need to rest," Zeke said firmly. "Everything looks bleaker when you're cold and tired. Tomorrow we can figure things out." He stood and gestured toward a door off the main room. "You'll rest in my bed tonight. I'll take the floor out here." Sarah looked up, startled by his offer. "I couldn't possibly, I insist," Zeke cut her off. "You've been through enough. The bedroom's warmer and the bed's comfortable. I've slept on worse than my own floor plenty of times." Too exhausted to argue, Sarah nodded gratefully. Zeke showed her to a small but tidy bedroom, where a large bed with a patchwork quilt dominated the space. He found her one of his shirts to sleep in, and tactfully left her alone to change. As Sarah slipped between the cool sheets, she was enveloped in the scent of soap and pine that she already associated with Zeke. Despite her grief over Thomas and her uncertain future, the events of the day had left her drained. She was asleep almost before her head touched the pillow. Morning brought pale sunlight filtering through the bedroom window. For a moment, Sarah was disoriented, but then the events of the previous day came rushing back. She lay still, listening to the sounds of movement in the other room, the clank of the stove door, the thud of boots on wooden floors, the soft crackle of the fire. When she finally emerged, dressed again in her own clothes, she found Zeke frying eggs and bacon at the stove. He looked up and gave her a gentle smile. "Good morning. Thought you might sleep the day away." "What time is it?" Sarah asked, embarrassed at the thought of oversleeping. "Just past 9. You needed the rest." He slid eggs onto a plate and handed it to her. "Eat up. Then we can talk about what comes next." Over breakfast, Zeke explained that Thomas's land would likely revert to the government since he hadn't fulfilled the 5 years required by the Homestead Act. "But," he added, seeing her crestfallen expression, "there might be a way for you to claim it, being his next of kin. We'd need to talk to the land office in town." "I don't know the first thing about homesteading," Sarah admitted. "I was a seamstress in Boston." Zeke considered this. The winter's no time to start anyway. Snow won't melt for months yet. He seemed to be wrestling with a thought. Finally, he spoke. I could use help around here. My housekeeper left last month to care for her ailing mother. The position includes room and board, and I'll pay fair wages. At least until spring, when you can decide what you want to do. Sarah studied him, trying to determine if there was any impropriety in his offer. His expression was open, his eyes clear and honest. That's very kind of you, Mr. Armstrong. Zeke, please, he corrected. And it's not just kindness. I really do need the help. Place has gone to shambles without Mrs. Cooper to keep things in order. Sarah looked around. The house was tidy enough, but she could see that it lacked a woman's touch. There was dust on the mantelpiece, the curtains needed mending, and the floor could use a good scrubbing. All right, she decided. I accept your offer until spring at least. Zeke's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Good, that's good. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Sarah took over the household duties, cooking meals, cleaning, mending Zeke's clothes, and generally bringing order to the bachelor household. Zeke taught her about ranch life, how to feed the chickens, collect eggs, milk the cow, and even how to make butter and cheese. Despite the harsh winter outside, inside the house grew warm with more than just fire. Sarah found herself watching Zeke when he wasn't looking the way his hands, strong enough to break a wild horse, could be so gentle when tending to a newborn calf, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the way he always made sure she had the best portion at meals. Zeke, for his part, found excuses to be in the house more than was strictly necessary. He'd linger over breakfast, telling her stories about ranch life or asking about her life in Boston. In the evenings, he'd read aloud from one of his small collection of books while she sewed or knitted by the fire. One night, about 3 weeks after her arrival, a particularly violent blizzard struck. The wind howled around the house like a living thing, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. Sarah had gone to bed, but found sleep impossible with the storm raging. When she heard a particularly loud thud from outside, followed by Zeke's footsteps and the front door opening, she rose in alarm. Wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, she ventured into the main room just as Zeke returned, snow swirling in behind him before he forced the door shut. What happened? She asked, raising her voice to be heard over the wind. Part of the stable roof, Zeke answered grimly. I need to move the horses into the barn before the whole thing comes down. I'll help, Sarah said immediately, already reaching for her coat. Zeke shook his head. It's too dangerous. The wind could knock you right off your feet. Then how will you manage alone? She challenged, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills before Zeke relented. Stay close to me. If I say run, you run back to the house, understand? Together they battled their way through the storm to the stable, where a section of the roof had indeed partially collapsed. The horses were panicked, rolling their eyes and stamping nervously. Zeke's steady voice and sure hands calmed them enough that he and Sarah could lead them one by one through the blinding snow to the larger barn nearby. By the time they had moved all 6 horses and secured the barn, they were both soaked through and freezing. They staggered back to the house, leaning on each other against the wind that threatened to tear them apart. Inside, they stood dripping on the floorboards, too cold to even shiver. Without a word, Zeke stoked the fire to a roar and pulled Sarah close to it. His fingers fumbled with the buttons of her coat. You need to get out of these wet clothes, he said, his voice husky. You'll catch pneumonia. Sarah's fingers were too numb to help, so she let him remove her coat and the sodden dress beneath it. She stood before him in just her chemise and petticoat, both damp but not soaked through. In any other circumstance, she would have been mortified, but right now survival took precedence over modesty. Zeke quickly stripped off his own wet outer layers down to his long underwear, then wrapped them both in blankets and pulled her down onto the rug before the fire. They sat side by side, slowly thawing, neither speaking of the intimate moment they had just shared. Thank you for helping with the horses, Zeke said finally, breaking the silence. Sarah turned to look at him. Firelight danced across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the curve of his lips. I couldn't let you face that alone. Something shifted in Zeke's expression. His eyes dropped to her mouth, then back up to meet her gaze. Sarah felt her heart begin to race, and not from cold or exertion. "Sarah," he said softly, her name like a prayer on his lips. "Yes," she whispered, hardly daring to breathe. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, fragile as frost on a windowpane. Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "I think I've already fallen," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. Zeke reached out, his hand gentle against her cheek. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tender at first, tentative, but when Sarah responded, it deepened with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Zeke rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find you," he murmured. "A half-frozen angel in my stable," Sarah laughed softly. "I'm no angel." "You are to me," he insisted, kissing her again. They spent the night by the fire, talking, kissing, learning each other by touch and word. As dawn broke and the storm began to subside, they reluctantly separated, each to their own room to dress for the day ahead, though something fundamental had changed between them. Over the following weeks, their relationship blossomed like wildflowers after spring rain. Stolen kisses while doing chores, hands brushing accidentally as they worked side by side, long conversations late into the night. Sarah learned that Zeke had inherited the ranch from his parents, who had died within months of each other 3 years prior. He had been alone ever since, pouring himself into the work of the ranch to avoid the emptiness of the house. "You've brought life back into these rooms," he told her one evening as they sat before the fire. "I didn't realize how hollow it was until you filled it." As winter began to loosen its grip on the land, however, Sarah grew increasingly anxious. Their arrangement had been until spring, and with the snow melting and the first green shoots appearing, she knew decisions would need to be made. One crisp March morning, Zeke announced he needed to go into town for supplies. "Would you like to come along?" "Might do you good to see something besides these 4 walls and my ugly mug," he teased. Sarah readily agreed. After being snowbound for so long, the prospect of a trip to town was exciting. They set out early, with Sarah wearing one of her dresses that Zeke had paid a neighboring rancher's wife to alter for her, as she had lost weight during the winter months. The town of Pine Ridge was small but bustling with activity now that the roads were passable again. Sarah drew curious glances as Zeke helped her down from the wagon, but he kept a protective hand at the small of her back, guiding her through the muddy streets. Their first stop was the general store, where Zeke introduced her to the proprietor, a friendly man named Harold Simmons. As they shopped, Sarah couldn't help but notice the speculative looks being cast their way. She realized that her presence at Zeke's ranch must have been a subject of gossip during the winter months. After the general store, Zeke suggested they visit the land office to inquire about Thomas's property. The land agent, a thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, listened to their story with interest. "As next of kin, you do have a claim to your brother's land, Miss Blackburn," he said after consulting his records. "However, since he had not completed the 5-year residence requirement, you would need to file a new homestead claim and fulfill the obligations yourself." "What obligations are those?" Sarah asked. The agent explained the requirements: building a dwelling, cultivating the land, living on the property for 5 years. It sounded overwhelming to Sarah, who had no experience with farming or building. As they left the land office, Zeke was unusually quiet. Sarah touched his arm. "Is something wrong?" He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Just thinking." He helped her back into the wagon, and they continued their errands in silence. Their final stop was the small church at the edge of town, where Zeke introduced Sarah to Reverend Miller, a kindly older man with a gentle smile. "Miss Blackburn is staying with me until she decides what to do about her brother's land," Zeke explained. The Reverend's eyebrows rose slightly, but his smile remained warm. "I see. And what are you leaning toward, Miss Blackburn?" Sarah hesitated. "I'm not sure yet. It seems a daunting task to homestead alone." "Indeed it would be," the Reverend agreed. "Few women undertake such a venture without a husband to help." The word husband seemed to hang in the air between them. Sarah felt her cheeks flush and avoided looking at Zeke. As they prepared to leave, Reverend Miller pulled Zeke aside for a private word. Sarah couldn't hear what was said, but when Zeke returned to her side, his expression was thoughtful. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the house, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, casting a golden glow over the land. Zeke helped Sarah down from the wagon, but instead of releasing her hand, he held it tight. "Sarah, I need to ask you something." Her heart fluttered in her chest. "Yes." He led her to a spot near the corral where wildflowers were beginning to push through the soil. "I was going to wait to do this properly, but the Reverend made me realize something today. People are talking about us living together like this." Sarah bit her lip. "I know, I saw the looks in town." "I don't give a damn what they think," Zeke said fiercely, "but I do care about your reputation, and more than that, I care about you." He took both her hands in his. "Sarah Blackburn, I love you. I think I started falling for you the moment I found you in my stable. These past months have been the happiest of my life." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "I don't want you to homestead alone. I don't want you to leave when spring comes. I want you to stay here with me as my wife. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes, blurring the image of this strong, kind man kneeling before her. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Zeke, I will marry you." He stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I don't have a ring yet, but we can pick one in town next time." "I don't need a ring," Sarah interrupted. "I just need you." They were married 2 weeks later in the little church in Pine Ridge, with Reverend Miller officiating and half the town in attendance, curious to see the woman who had captured the heart of Zeke Armstrong. Sarah wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair. Zeke wore his best shirt and a new suit ordered specially from the general store. As they exchanged vows, Sarah couldn't help but think about how much her life had changed in just a few months. She had arrived in Montana expecting to start a new life with her brother, only to find herself alone and desperate. Now she stood beside the man she loved, promising to share his life forever. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Miller said, beaming at them. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Armstrong." Zeke didn't need to be told twice. He gathered Sarah into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, to the cheers and whistles of the onlookers. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with neighbors bringing food and drink. There was music and dancing late into the night. Sarah moved through the crowd, meeting people who would now be part of her community, her extended family. Late in the evening, Zeke found her standing alone on the porch, gazing up at the stars. "Happy?" he asked, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. Sarah leaned back against his chest. "More than I ever thought possible." "You know," Zeke said, his voice low in her ear, "I've been sleeping on that floor for months now, watching you go into my bedroom alone every night." Sarah turned in his arms, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. And now," he said, sweeping her up into his arms for the second time since they'd met, "you're my wife, and I don't have to sleep on the floor anymore." Sarah laughed as he carried her through the house, past the remaining guests who smiled knowingly, and into the bedroom that was now truly theirs to share. In the years that followed, the Armstrong ranch prospered. Zeke and Sarah worked side by side, through good seasons and bad, through droughts and blizzards, through the births of their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. They eventually built a new, larger house to accommodate their growing family. but they kept the old one standing as a reminder of where their story began. Sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howled around their home, Sarah would think back to that desperate night when she had sought shelter in a stranger's stable. How close she had come to freezing to death, how different her life might have been if Zeke hadn't checked on his horses that night. "What are you thinking about?" Zeke would ask, noticing her faraway look. And Sarah would smile, leaning into the warmth of the man who had saved her in more ways than one. "Just how lucky I am that you found me sleeping in your cold stable that night." "No," Zeke would correct her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'm the lucky one. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me." And as they held each other close, safe and warm while winter raged outside, they knew that some journeys, no matter how difficult or painful they might begin, could lead to the most unexpected and beautiful destinations.